The air in the northern spires of Kaelen used to carry the resonant song of high winds cutting through quartz-veined stone, but lately it carried only the smell of damp ash and a suffocating, heavy silence. My name is Vexali, lead scout of the spires, and for generations my long-limbed, slate-skinned people had thrived high in these sheer basalt cliffs. We were a species naturally attuned to the subtle electromagnetic pulses of the planet itself, reading those faint Earth signals to predict seismic shifts and avoid the hyper-predators of the lowlands. Everything changed 5 solar cycles ago when the humans arrived in their rusted colony ship Pioneer's Promise, fleeing a ruined solar system and begging the Galactic Accord for emergency settlement rights. Our High Elders granted them the damp, mineral-rich valley bordered by our cliffside homes, expecting a peaceful coexistence, but the humans brought noise, industrial smoke, and an uneasy friction. For 4 cycles we maintained a fragile distance, until 3 lunar cycles ago when our hatchlings began to vanish without a single trace. The first to disappear was Little Vale, a 6th-cycle hatchling who strayed 20 paces beyond our lower boundary stone to gather fallen quartz and simply never returned by nightfall. Within 2 months, 13 more children vanished, leaving no thermal footprints, no broken flora, no blood, and no distress signals registered by our perimeter arrays. I stood in the high chamber watching Ambassador Thorn speak through his translator matrix, his small, round human frame clothed in a crisp uniform while his eyes shifted nervously across our tall stone pillars. Elders of the Spire, I assure you on my honor that Terran security has run full orbital and ground sweeps, Thorn declared with a voice dripping in practiced, oily sympathy. Our perimeter defense arrays show 0 kinetic discharges, 0 energy weapon signatures, and no unauthorized human personnel within 2 miles of your lower borders. Step forward from the shadow of the quartz pillars. My hand rested near my belt as I challenged his pleasantries directly. Our children are missing, Ambassador, and they do not simply evaporate into the atmosphere, I snapped, glaring down at him. Your colony has expanded its agricultural perimeter 30% closer to our cliffs in the last 2 seasons, and now our young are gone. Thorn offered me a thin, symmetrical smile that made the skin along my neck prickle with instinctual disgust. Scout Vexali, I understand your grief, Thorn replied smoothly, but accusing us of kidnapping or harm without a single shred of physical evidence is a dangerous breach of the Accord. Perhaps your native predators have adapted to your traditional wards, or perhaps your children are simply wandering into deep sinkholes. I took a step closer to his delegation and spat back. Kalari children know the ground better than you know your own ship's corridors. Before the tension could boil over, High Elder Oler raised a long, blue-hued hand to quiet us, his milky, aged eyes staring down at the human diplomat with absolute coldness. Enough, Vexali, Oler commanded gently, before addressing the human. We hear your words, Ambassador Thorn, but understand this clearly. If a single human hand is found to be linked to these losses, the Galactic Accord will not save your valley. Thorn bowed respectfully, though the sudden rigidity in his shoulders betrayed his composure as he turned to leave. We desire only peace, Elder, good evening, Thorn offered quietly before heading toward his waiting shuttle. As his transport hummed away into the darkening sky, I stared down at the base of our cliffs where a dense, glowing belt of tall, ruby-red flora shimmered under the moon. The humans called it the Crimson Veil and claimed it was a harmless terraforming project, but when I focused my electromagnetic senses on the thicket, I felt no natural pulse, only a low, heavy, unnatural hum that made my blood run cold. Standard scanners were useless against an enemy that left no energy signatures, so I realized I had to use a primitive, low-tech tracking method to find the truth. I brought my 8-cycle-old nephew, Kylo, down to the base of the lower cliffs near the edge of the human sector to act as unwitting bait while I watched from above. Stay within 5 paces of the rocky outcrop, Kylo, I instructed as I smeared a tiny drop of synthetic bioluminescent dye across his shoulder. If your body panics, this dye will glow bright ultraviolet under my scope. The moment you feel anything unusual, you drop to the dirt. Kylo blinked his 4 large eyes in unison and whispered, "I am not afraid, Uncle." I patted his head solemnly and told him, "Fear keeps us alive, little one, so keep it close." I climbed the jagged basalt wall, slipping into a shadowed crevice where I pulled down my long-range optical scope to zoom in on Kylo as he casually flipped over river stones. Beyond the boundary line stood the broad, velvet red leaves of the Crimson Veil, standing twice the height of an adult Kalari and glowing softly in the midday sun. For 2 excruciating hours nothing happened, but just as the sun dipped lower, the natural wind died entirely and the leaves of the Crimson Veil began to move in a rhythmic, breathing motion. Tiny pores beneath the leaves opened and released a faint violet mist that drifted lazily toward the rocks where my nephew played. The moment the mist touched Kylo, he froze mid-step, his heart rate skyrocketing as the dye patch on his shoulder flared into a blinding ultraviolet light that confirmed he was in absolute terror. Yet, despite his internal panic, Kylo's body language went totally slack and his eyes glossed over into a dreamy, tranquil stare as the neurotoxin paralyzed his motor commands and suppressed his vocal cords. He did not scream or run. Instead, he turned and took calm, deliberate steps directly into the red thicket while I shouted into my silent comms in vain. The moment his foot crossed the boundary line, the ground beneath the red plants exploded, and 2 thick, pale roots covered in barbed thorns shot up like steel traps to snap around his ankles. The roots cracked his bones with an audible sound and began hauling his small body downward into a rapidly widening sinkhole in the dirt. Even as he was dragged under, Kylo didn't cry out because the mist had flooded his brain with a euphoric narcotic, leaving him smiling serenely as he sank into the dark. I threw myself off the cliff face, sliding down the sharp scree and driving my body across the distance before diving headfirst toward the edge of the collapsing pit. Kylo was already buried to his waist, and inside the hole I caught a horrific glimpse of a bulbous digestive pod filled with bubbling acid and dissolved bone fragments. I grabbed my nephew by his collar, drew my kinetic pulse blade, and drove it directly into the primary root holding him. The plant's severed tissue erupted with a pressurized jet of clear acid that hit my arm gauntlet, instantly eating through the heavy alloy and scorching my flesh with liquid fire. Gritting my teeth against the agonizing burn, I slammed the blade's secondary kinetic shockwave into the dirt, shattering the root network and allowing me to yank Kylo's limp body free just as the pit caved in, leaving the red ferns to settle back into a quiet, motionless silence. The medical bay in the northern spire smelled of ozone, heavy antiseptic, and burned flesh as I sat on a stone slab while the chief apothecary applied a cool, blue cooling gel to the deep, bubbling chemical burns on my left arm. Nearby, Kylo lay unconscious on a hover gurney, his crushed leg set in a white bone knitting cast while a mechanical filter purred softly, drawing the lingering euphoric neurotoxins out of his bloodstream. Encased within a glowing, reinforced containment field on the central table lay the severed section of the plant root I had hacked away during the rescue, its pale flesh still pulsing with a sickening, rhythmic tremor. High Elder Oler stood over the glass enclosure alongside Dr. Valen, our lead bioanalyst, their faces illuminated by the harsh blue light of the analysis monitors hanging overhead. Elder Oler leaned down, his milky, aged eyes wide with a mix of sorrow and mounting fury as he gestured toward the specimen. "Tell me what we are looking at, Dr. Valen, because I refuse to believe nature produced such a calculated nightmare," Oler demanded, his quiet voice echoing off the curved stone walls. Dr. Valen tapped a series of commands into his console, projecting a 3-dimensional holographic rendering of the Crimson Veil above the containment unit. "Your instincts are correct, Elder," Valen said, highlighting the plant's vascular structure in neon green. "This is not a natural mutation of Terran flora, but a targeted, bioengineered synthetic predator that we are calling Phytophagus imperialis. The broad leaves release a volatile aerosol containing an advanced compound engineered to act exclusively on Kalari neural pathways, inducing total physical paralysis and vocal suppression while flooding the brain's pleasure centers." Valen zoomed in on the root network, showing the subterranean chamber I had glimpsed in the sinkhole. The roots drag the target into a subterranean digestive sac that secretes an industrial-grade acid with a pH low enough to dissolve flesh, cartilage, and bone within 3 hours, Kaelen continued soberly. The plant then absorbs the resulting nutrient slurry directly into its vascular system, leaving zero organic residue behind, which explains why our perimeter scanners never registered a single trace of our missing children. Elder Oler stared at the hologram, his ancient hands curling into tight, trembling fists as he whispered, "Those monsters built a meat grinder along our border and watched us search for our dead while offering search parties." I leaned forward on the stone table, gritting my teeth through the burning pain in my arm as I pulled up our geological mapping overlays onto Kaelen's display console. "It is even worse than a simple bioweapon, Elder," I said, pointing to a series of bright yellow veins running deep beneath the valley floor. "Look at the spatial distribution of their crimson veil thickets. The humans didn't plant these gardens at random along our boundary line. The entire red belt sits directly above Kaelen's shallow methane gas veins, which stretch from the valley floor straight beneath the foundations of our northern spires." Elder Oler gasped softly, his face turning pale as he realized the trap the human colony had constructed around us. "They have locked us into a checkmate," I explained grimly. "If we march our defense forces down to the border and open fire with plasma rifles or heavy kinetic weaponry to burn the fields, a single stray energy bolt will ignite the underground methane veins and blow the cliffs right out from under our homes. If we send soldiers down to uproot the plants manually with physical tools, the plant's high-pressure acid defense mechanism will dissolve our troops before they can clear a single acre." Elder Oler shook his head slowly and asked, "What if we present this biological evidence to the Galactic Accord Council?" I shook my head bitterly in response. "Ambassador Thorn will simply claim the plants were a terraforming experiment that mutated out of control, pay a minor fine, and by the time an off-world court sends an investigator 2 solar cycles from now, our species' next generation will already be dead." A heavy, suffocating silence settled over the medical bay as the reality of our situation sank in, but Dr. Kaelen broke the quiet by stepping toward a dark glass biome at the rear of the laboratory. "If we cannot use plasma fire or brute force, then we must fight their biological weapon with one of our own," Kaelen stated, tapping the glass to illuminate a bed of damp cave dirt where a cluster of pale, grayish-blue mushrooms rested. "This is Clathris cineris, the ash blight, a native mold that grows in our deepest caverns to feed on decaying mineral detritus. My team has spent the last 3 days analyzing the severed root tissue Kaelen recovered, and we discovered that the crimson veil cannot survive on Kaelen's natural soil alone." I stood up and walked over to the glass tank, peering inside at the frail mold. "What is keeping their plants alive then?" I asked. Kaelen adjusted his console, displaying the chemical breakdown of the soil along the human border. "The humans are secretly pumping a hyper-concentrated synthetic nitrogen peptide compound into the ground through a buried, high-pressure irrigation grid connected to their central depot," Kaelen explained. "The crimson veil is addicted to this liquid fertilizer, and over 20 generations of forced breeding, we have modified the ash blight fungus to feed exclusively on that exact human chemical formula. When a single spore touches their liquid fertilizer, it explodes into a voracious, black fungal web that consumes the compound in seconds, starving the plants until their own internal acid turns on them and dissolves their vascular walls from the inside out." Elder Oler looked at the glowing blue mushrooms with newfound hope, but his brow furrowed as he considered the logistics of deploying such a weapon. "Can we disperse these fungal spores from our high cliffs using the mountain wind?" Oler asked. Kaelen shook his head regretfully and answered, "No, Elder, the valley winds are too erratic and would blow the spores away or disperse them too thinly to infect the root system. To achieve total eradication before the humans realize what is happening, the ash blight spores must be introduced directly into the primary mixing reservoir inside the Terran Central Agricultural Station, located 2 miles deep within their fortified compound." I looked down at my bandaged arm, feeling the cold rage burning beneath my skin as I pulled my scout harness over my shoulders and buckled my kinetic blade to my belt. The humans built a quiet, invisible trap to murder our children while hiding behind their diplomatic treaties, I said, looking Elder Oler directly in his milky eyes. They believe we are too rigid, too bound by honor to strike back in the dark, but I will deliver their harvest personally. Elder Oler placed a long, cool hand on my shoulder and gave a single, solemn nod as he whispered, "Go with the earth's pulse, Bexali, and bring an end to the silence." The sky broke open at midnight as a Kaelen monsoon descended upon the valley with terrifying fury, cracking thunder across the basalt cliffs and dumping deafening sheets of water that turned the dry dirt into a rushing river of mud. For a human soldier, the storm was a nightmare of ruined visibility, but for a Kalari scout, it was a godsend that scrambled their thermal sensors and masked the sound of my approach. Wearing a slicker suit of dark, non-reflective mesh, I crawled through the tall prairie grass on my belly, ignoring the sharp rocks slicing through my clothing and the throbbing ache in my bandaged left arm. Ahead of me loomed the outer perimeter of the Terran Central Agricultural Station, a 10-foot-tall steel fence topped with concertina wire and swept by automated kinetic turrets that hummed through the torrential rain. I pressed myself flat against the saturated soil, watching the rhythmic sweep of a guard tower's spotlight as it cut through the downpour, counting the 3-second delay between sweeps before darting forward. I slapped a small electromagnetic pulse pad against the base of the fence's power junction, holding my breath as a tiny blue spark short-circuited the local electrical grid for 5 precious seconds. Using my heavy wire cutters, I snipped a narrow opening through the fence mesh, slipping inside like a ghost and pressing my back against the corrugated metal wall of a massive storage silo just as the perimeter circuit reset with a sharp hum. Navigating the interior of the compound required agonizing patience, as human guards in heavy waterproof slickers walked the gravel paths carrying short-range plasma carbines. I moved silently from shadow to shadow, using the roar of the storm to cover my footsteps until I finally reached the reinforced steel door of the primary pumping station. Pulling a small interface splicer from my harness, I pressed it against the biometric lock, watching a waterfall of encrypted human code cascade across its tiny screen while I pressed into the recess of the doorway to avoid an approaching guard. The guard's flashlight beam brushed past my mud-caked boots, but he passed by without stopping, and a moment later a soft chime signaled that the lock had yielded. Inside, the air was warm and heavy with the deafening roar of 3 massive industrial pumps that vibrated through the metal flooring like the heartbeat of an iron beast. Suspended over the center of the room hung a 5,000-gallon glass reservoir tank filled with a thick, glowing blue liquid, the concentrated synthetic nitrogen fertilizer feeding the crimson veil along our border. I scrambled up the slick metal catwalks to the top of the tank, pulling the pressurized canister of ash blight spores from my chest harness as I unlatched the primary intake valve. I broke the seal and injected the pressurized cloud of gray dust directly into the blue liquid, watching in triumph as microscopic threads of black fungus bloomed across the glowing reservoir in a matter of seconds, ready to poison the entire irrigation grid. 48 hours later, Elder Oler, Dr. Valen, and I stood on the highest viewing ledge of the northern spire, peer through long-range optical arrays at the human border strip below. At first, the broad, velvet red leaves of the crimson veil seemed unaffected, but as the spore-choked liquid reached their subterranean root networks, the reaction became absolute and terrifyingly swift. Through my scope, I watched the vibrant ruby color fade into a sickly, bruised purple, and then the stalks began to buckle as the voracious fungus devoured the synthetic fertilizer, starving the plants until their own internal acid dissolved their vascular walls from the inside out. The tall red stalks burst open, spilling a thick, tar-like sludge onto the dirt as the subterranean digestive pods collapsed into shallow, harmless craters of inert black ash. By the 4th morning, the entire 3-mile belt of human bioweapons had rotted away into a wasteland of sterile gray mulch, leaving behind no acid, no traps, and no threat to our children. An hour later, an emergency shuttle tore through the rain clouds and slammed down hard on our lower landing pad, its thrusters kicking up clouds of steam. Ambassador Thorn marched out of the ship, flanked by 4 heavily armed security officers, his face flushed with rage as he stomped up the stone steps toward Elder Oler and me. "You," Thorn bellowed, pointing a trembling finger at the Elder. "You destroyed our terraforming grid. 3 years of biological research and millions of credits of agricultural infrastructure, ruined in 3 days." High Elder Oler stood perfectly still, his long robes fluttering in the wind as he looked down at the furious human diplomat with serene composure. "Ambassador Thorn," Oler said softly, his deep voice echoing off the quartz pillars. "You seem terribly distressed. What has occurred?" Thorn stepped closer, his teeth gritted in fury as he gestured toward the valley floor. "A hyper-aggressive fungal spore targeted our specific crop lines, choked our irrigation pumps, and rotted the entire border plantation. It was a deliberate biological attack." I stepped forward, crossing my hands behind my back and looking down at the ambassador with the exact symmetrical posture he had used months ago. "That is a serious accusation, Ambassador," I said smoothly. "I assure you, Kaelari defense arrays show 0 kinetic discharges, 0 chemical deployments, and no unauthorized personnel within your sector." Thorn choked on his next breath, his eyes widening in shock as he realized he was trapped in his own web of lies. "Kaelen is an ancient, wild planet, Ambassador," I continued, stepping closer until my shadow fell over him. "Our native flora and fungi are remarkably unpredictable, and sometimes foreign plants simply cannot survive the local ecology. Perhaps your agricultural team made a flaw in their soil calculations?" Thorn opened his mouth to shout an accusation, but the words died in his throat as he realized that proving our sabotage would force him to confess to the Galactic Accord that he had engineered illegal, acid-spewing bioweapons to murder our children. Caught in the trap of his own plausible deniability, Thorn turned on his heel without a word and retreated to his shuttle, leaving our border clear, our children safe, and the mountain winds free once more. The morning following Ambassador Thorn's bitter departure brought a crisp, clear light to the northern spires, sweeping away the lingering scent of damp ash that had hung over our homes for cycles. I stood on the high stone terrace beside my nephew, Kaelen, watching the sun rise over the valley floor where the dark band of sterile gray mulch was already beginning to wash away under a soft morning mist. The metallic hum from the Terran agricultural station had fallen completely silent, replaced by the natural, resonant psalm of the mountain wind cutting through quartz-veined stone. Kaelen leaned lightly against my leg, his bone knitting cast glowing faintly blue as his recovery progressed, his 4 large eyes scanning the vast, open boundary where he had nearly lost his life. "Uncle Vexali, will the red grass ever grow back?" he asked softly, his small voice echoing into the calm morning air. I placed my hand gently on his shoulder, feeling his steady, peaceful pulse throbbing beneath his slate blue skin. "No, little one," I answered quietly, looking down at him with a reassuring nod. "The red grass needed a poison to live, a poison the humans can no longer give it. The earth here has rejected it, and it will never return to these cliffs." Kaelen looked out over the boundary once more, his posture relaxed and completely free of the terror that had gripped him just days before. "Then we can go back down to collect glow beetles by the river stones?" he inquired, a small, hopeful smile appearing on his face. I smiled back and told him, "When your leg is fully healed, we will gather all the quartz and glow beetles you can carry." A soft rustle of heavy robes announced the arrival of High Elder Oler, who stepped onto the stone terrace accompanied by Dr. Valen. Oler carried a traditional silver ceremonial vessel, its surface etched with the ancient symbols of our ancestors, while Valen carried a portable scanner displaying the latest environmental readings from the valley. The lower perimeter sensors report complete ecological stabilization, Scout Vexali, Dr. Valen reported, tapping the interface to show us the green diagnostic graphs. "The ash blight fungus has completely starved to death now that the synthetic nitrogen grid is empty, leaving behind 0 trace of toxicity in the soil or groundwater." Our native mosses and low alpine flowers are already reclaiming the valley floor, completely unburdened by human manipulation. Elder Oler nodded solemnly, looking down at the boundary line with a mixture of profound relief and quiet sorrow for the hatchlings we were too late to save. We have preserved our future without breaking our covenant with the Galactic Accord, Oler said softly, raising the silver vessel toward the morning sun in a gesture of remembrance. We did not fire a single plasma bolt, nor did we give Ambassador Thorn the war he so desperately sought to justify. But we must remain vigilant, for humans are a persistent species, and quiet hatred often takes new forms when exposed to the light. I bowed my head respectfully to the elder and replied, "Their quiet war failed because they underestimated our connection to this planet. They believed technology and bioengineering made them masters of nature, but nature belongs to Kaelen." Later that afternoon, I led a scouting party down to the lower boundary stone to conduct our first physical inspection of the border since the collapse of the Crimson Veil. Where once stood a terrifying, silent forest of red stalks and hidden acid pods, there was now only rich, dark earth smelling of damp mineral soil and fresh rain. The heavy scent of the euphoric neurotoxin had vanished entirely, replaced by the clean, sharp smell of native wild thyme blooming along the rocky outcrops. My scouts moved across the ground with measured, confident steps, checking every crevice and sinkhole to ensure that not a single root or seed pod remained functional. As we reached the edge of the human agricultural sector, a lone Terran transport vehicle hummed along their side of the fence, its driver stopping briefly to look out at us through reinforced glass. I stood tall at the boundary line, crossing my arms over my chest and staring back at the driver with cold, unyielding resolve until the vehicle turned and sped away toward their central colony domes. One of my young scouts, a sharp-eyed soldier named Tael, walked up beside me and looked down at the empty earth. "They know we defeated them, lead scout," Tael remarked quietly, his hand resting on the hilt of his pulse blade. "And they know they can never prove how we did it." I looked back up toward the high basalt cliffs of our home, where the hatchlings were already coming out onto the lower terraces to play under the watchful eyes of their caretakers, their joyful calls echoing off the canyon walls. "Let them wonder, Tael," I said, a rare, faint smile touching my lips as I took a deep breath of the mountain air. "They built a weapon of silence to steal our children, but in the end, the silence swallowed them instead. As long as the northern spires stand, our children will play in the light, and our world will belong to those who honor its life." With the border secured and the silent threat eradicated, I turned my back on the human colony and led my scouts home, walking side by side into a future restored. 3 solar cycles had passed since the great rot of the Crimson Veil, and the northern spires of Kaelen had returned to their ancient, rhythmic vitality. The barren strip of black ash along the valley floor had long since been buried under a lush carpet of native blue moss and wild quartz lilies, erasing every visible trace of the silent war. Down in the sunlit clearings near the lower river stones, the laughter of Kalari hatchlings rang out like silver bells, their joyful calls echoing freely off the basalt cliffs. I stood on the high scouting terrace alongside Kylo, who was now a tall, nimble youth of 11 cycles, his 4 eyes sharp and observant as he adjusted the strap of his optical scope. "Look at the eastern boundary line, Uncle Vexali," Kylo said, gesturing down toward the valley with a confident turn of his hand. "The humans have set up a new perimeter fence, but it sits 2 miles further back from our boundary stones than their old one." I pulled down my own optical glass, focusing on the distant metal barrier that the Terrans had erected near their inner colony domes. "They are treading carefully now, Kylo," I replied, a cool note of satisfaction in my voice. "When a predator loses its teeth in the dark, it learns to respect the shadows." Kylo smiled, watching a group of young hatchlings chase glowing crystal beetles near the exact spot where he had once been dragged beneath the soil. "Ambassador Thorn was recalled to their homeworld last season, was he not?" Kylo asked, turning his gaze toward me. I gave a single, slow nod and told him, yes. The Terran colonial administration grew weary of his failed agricultural projects and his inability to secure extra land. They replaced him with an administrator who prefers written treaties over secret gardens. A heavy, measured footstep sounded behind us on the stone terrace as High Elder Oler approached, his long silver robes rustling softly against the polished quartz floor. Though his milky eyes were clouded with age, his presence remained as commanding as the basalt spires themselves. You watch the valley floor as if you expect the red leaves to bloom again, Bexali, Elder Oler observed quietly, stopping beside us to rest his hand on the carved stone railing. I turned to bow respectfully to the elder before answering. A scout's duty never truly ends, High Elder. The humans learned that our biology could fight back, but fear is a temporary shield. Eventually, new leaders arrive who forget the hard lessons of the past. Elder Oler looked out over the thriving valley, taking a deep breath of the mountain air that now smelled of rain and blooming mountain flora. You speak with great wisdom, Lead Scout, but do not let vigilance swallow your peace, Oler counseled gently. The Galactic Accord has formally ratified our expanded border sanctuary, securing this entire valley for our spires in perpetuity. The Terrans have signed the document, agreeing that any unapproved botanical or atmospheric manipulation within 5 leagues of our cliffs will be treated as an act of open war. I looked at the elder and asked, and do you believe they will honor their own signatures this time? Oler offered a faint, enigmatic smile and replied, they will honor it as long as they remember the ash blight, and as long as our scouts keep their blades sharp. Later that evening, as the twin moons of Kaelen rose over the eastern peaks, casting a shimmering silver veil across the valley, I walked down to the lower boundary stones alone. The night air was cool and crisp, carrying the low, comforting hum of the planet's electromagnetic pulse that vibrated through the soles of my boots. I stopped at the precise line where the crimson veil had once reached its thorny roots into our world, kneeling down to run my fingers through the damp, rich cave soil. There were no synthetic chemicals here now, no paralyzed silence, and no hidden digestive acid lurking beneath the earth. There was only the vibrant, living pulse of our homeworld. A faint rustle in the prairie grass made my hand instinctively drop to the hilt of my kinetic blade, but I relaxed as Dr. Valen stepped out from the shadows of the quartz outcrop, holding a small metal recording tablet. Searching for ghosts, Bexali? Valen asked, his voice breaking the calm quiet of the night as he walked over to join me. I stood up, shaking the dark dirt from my gauntlet, and looked back toward the twinkling lights of the human colony domes in the distance. I was just remembering how close we came to losing everything, I admitted softly. If we had reacted with brute force, if we had fired a single energy bolt into those methane veins, this entire valley would be a crater of glass. Dr. Valen nodded thoughtfully, tapping his recording tablet to log the evening's clear atmospheric readings. We defeated them because we understood that true power isn't about destroying your enemy with thunder, Valen said, looking up at the high stone spires rising into the starry sky. It is about understanding the delicate threads that connect all living things, and knowing which thread to cut when a predator enters your home. I looked up toward the illuminated windows of the high spires, where families were gathering for the evening meal, their laughter and song carrying softly down the cliff face on the evening wind. We gave our children back their future, I said quietly, stepping away from the border and turning my back on the human lights for the final time. And as long as the northern spires touch the sky, we will guard that future against any shadow that dares to creep into our light. Dr. Valen walked alongside me as we began our slow climb back up the stone steps toward the warm sanctuary of our homes, leaving the silent boundary behind us, completely peaceful, completely clear, and entirely free. Several generations had passed since the era of the Crimson Veil, and the story of the Quiet War had faded from a living terror into a legendary chronicle taught to every young scout in the northern spires. I sat atop the high observation ridge, my aged slate skin etched with deep lines that bore witness to dozens of solar cycles spent guarding these basalt cliffs. Beside me stood my great-grandniece, Lyra, a sharp-eyed scout initiate whose 4 eyes burned with the same fierce curiosity that my nephew Kylo had possessed so long ago. Down in the valley, the humans had long since abandoned their industrial ambitions near our border, their colony domes now reduced to distant, quiet structures that respected our territory. Great-Uncle Vexali, tell me true, Lyra said softly, her voice cutting through the crisp mountain breeze. Did the humans really believe they could erase our young without paying a price? I adjusted the weathered shoulder strap of my optical harness, looking down at the lush green meadow where quartz lilies bloomed in brilliant clusters across the former boundary line. They believed that because we loved peace, we were weak, I answered, my deep voice echoing slightly against the stone outcroppings. They thought our honor would blind us to their deception, and that their diplomatic treaties would shield them from our vengeance. Lyra ran her fingers along the hilt of her kinetic pulse blade, her brow furrowing in contemplation. If they had succeeded, if you had not found the plants in time, would our spires have fallen to war? She asked. I turned my head to meet her gaze and told her, we would have burned the valley to glass before letting them starve our future. But true strength lies in outsmarting a trap rather than springing it. The sound of soft, rhythmic footsteps announced the approach of Kylo, now an honored high elder of the northern spires whose silver-trimmed robes fluttered gently in the wind. Though his legs still carried a faint, noble limp from the day the plant's roots had shattered his bones, his posture was imposing and full of quiet authority. You are filling her head with old war stories again, Vexali, Kylo said with a warm, rumbling laugh, stepping beside us to look out over our ancestral lands. I offered my nephew a faint, knowing smile and replied, a scout who forgets the traps of the past is doomed to walk into the snares of the future, Elder Kylo. Kylo rested his hand on Lyra's shoulder, looking down at the valley with an expression of profound serenity that had taken decades to cultivate. He speaks the truth, Lyra, Kylo admitted, his voice softening as he recalled the dark days of his youth. When I was dragged into that pit, I felt no pain at first, only a sweet, intoxicating silence that made me want to surrender. The humans designed their cruelty to be comfortable, to make us go quietly into the dark, but your great-uncle refused to let the silence take me. Lyra looked between the two of us, her eyes wide with reverence as she absorbed the weight of our species' survival. How do we ensure the Terrans never attempt such treachery again? She inquired firmly. Kylo turned his gaze toward the horizon where the sun was beginning to dip below the mountain peaks, painting the sky in vibrant shades of violet and crimson. We remind them that we are part of this world, and this world protects its own, Kylo declared solemnly. Our botanists still maintain the ash blight strains in our deepest cave vaults, and our scouts still sweep every foot of soil along the border every single morning. The humans know that if they ever plant another seed of malice in our dirt, the harvest they reap will destroy them long before they reach our gates. Later that evening, a diplomatic delegation from the Terran Colonial Authority arrived at the lower reception hall to renew the Centennial Peace Accord. The new human envoy, a tall woman named Commander Hayes, walked across the polished quartz floor with a crisp, respectful step, flanked by her aides who carried no weapons. She stopped before Elder Kylo and bowed deeply, extending a parchment treaty bound in silver foil. Elders of the Spire, the Terran administration offers this renewed covenant of peace, Commander Hayes announced, her tone respectful and entirely devoid of the oily arrogance that Ambassador Thorn had once displayed. We recognize your absolute sovereignty over the valley and pledge that our colonies will remain forever within our designated borders. Elder Kylo took the scroll into his long, slate-blue hands, inspecting the seals with deliberate care before looking into the commander's eyes. We accept your covenant, Commander Hayes, Kylo said, his voice echoing with absolute authority through the high stone hall. May your people remember that peace is not merely the absence of weapons, but the presence of respect. Commander Hayes offered a firm nod and replied, our historians have documented the mistakes of our predecessors, Elder. We have no desire to disturb the balance of Kaelen ever again. A wise sentiment, Kylo responded smoothly, for nature on this world has a way of weeding out those who seek to corrupt it. After the human delegation departed back to their transports, I stood alongside Kaelen and Lyra on the outer balcony, watching their ship's lights vanish into the darkening evening sky. The mountain winds rose, carrying the sweet, resonant psalm of the high cliffs as it whistled through the quartz veins of our home, completely unpolluted and entirely free. Down in the valley, the laughter of new hatchlings drifted up on the warm air currents, a sweet and endless chorus that filled the night with life. Lyra smiled as she listened to the children playing in the clearings below, her hand resting comfortably on her scout harness. "Listen to that, great uncle," she whispered happily. "The valley is full of music tonight." I took a deep breath of the cold, clean air, feeling the steady, eternal pulse of Kaelen vibrating through the stone beneath my feet, knowing that our struggle had not been in vain. "It is the sound of our people enduring, Lyra," I said softly, resting my hand on her shoulder as we stood together under the glowing stars. "The humans tried to harvest our future with silence, but we gave our world its voice back. And as long as these spires touch the sky, that voice will never be silenced again."